much, and let us bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns. She's a CBSN political contributor and a national political reporter for RealClearPolitics, and joins me right now on the set. Okay, so we're going to talk about Cohn a little bit later. Okay. But first I want to talk about Lindsey Graham, who, you know, is a vocal critic of the president. But he said something really interesting we saw in that story. He said, listen, he's not unhinged. This is part of his strategy, this swing, this the attacks on members of Congress. He doesn't know if it's smart, but it is strategy. What do you make of his assessment?
Sure. In many respects, Lindsey Graham is correct. Donald Trump ran his presidential campaign against establishment Republicans, against establishment Democrats, against Washington in general. Republicans are not entirely surprised that he is behaving this way, lashing out at members of his own party, because he's been doing it for at least the past 2.5 years. Right. What's surprising to a lot of lawmakers is that they thought once Trump became president that the office might humble him, and they also thought that he would be a vessel for their agenda items, that he would want wins as much as they do. Right. And now they're seeing their philosophies really coming into a clash here. And what the president is doing is part of a strategy. I mean, we saw in that Phoenix.
It's to what end? Like, I'm looking at, you know, some of the newspaper editorials today, right? The Washington Post. Trump distances himself from the GOP, right? Right. The Wall Street Journal. Trump divorces the GOP Congress. Right. What is the purpose here?
There are lots of questions going on right now about whether the president actually wants victories or whether he wants to kind of just continue to stick it to the establishment, to the party, as he has done in the past. Now, there are some questions, of course, about that, whether that is he finds himself in a situation where he hasn't been able to secure wins. He hasn't been able to make the deals that he pledged to. So now he's kind of going back to his base of support, and he's concerned a little bit, you can tell, of that base eroding. So he's going back, kind of trying to rev up the base in advance of these big ticket items that Congress has to do, and trying to put pressure on members. We haven't seen that be entirely effective. No. We didn't see that as effective on the health care bill. We'll see what it does to members, but members have shown that they're not entirely scared of this president.
Yeah, you know, the thing about it, I know Congress is the approval rating for Congress is pretty low, pretty dismal. But you know what we always hear about these approval ratings is that people don't like Congress, but they always like their representative.
Exactly.
So that, you got to wonder if that sort of bullying is really going to have an impact. Right. But speaking of that, the president tweeted out this morning about Bob Corker. We know Bob Corker criticized him, said that maybe he didn't have the stability to be effective. And there's the president's tweet right there saying, oh, that's an interesting thing for him to say, considering he's always coming to me, asking me whether or not he should run again in 2018. Now, Bob Corker criticized him like a week ago. Right. What do you make of this?
Right. Well, interestingly, Bob Corker was also considered on the short list at a time for vice president, for secretary of state. Right. He has been not like Lindsey Graham and critical of him the whole time. He has been advising the president. It's important to note, too, that Bob Corker is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, a key important committee, and him questioning the president's stability in that interview last week raised a lot of alarm bells in the Republican Party, just because he is a respected member of it, but also his perch in terms of foreign affairs is really key here. So Donald Trump has shown that he, of course, does not take criticisms lightly. We know that about him. Lashing out at Republicans like Corker everybody knows, is not a productive use of time, especially when you have little margin for error on legislation coming up. Republicans, of course, wish that the president would focus that energy on Democrats up for re-election next year. The Republican Party wants to expand its map after 2018, get more Republicans in the Senate so that they can pass legislation more easily. The president's strategy does not help them do that.
Yeah. And we are still talking about his speech in Phoenix and some of the things that he said. And one of the things that he said in Phoenix was that, hey, maybe we need to shut down the government if we can't get funding for this wall between Mexico and the U.S. So Sarah Huckabee Sanders was asked about that. Let's listen to what she had to say, and we'll talk on the other side.
Sir, the president promised over and over again during the campaign that Mexico would pay for the wall. So why is he now threatening a government shutdown if Congress won't pay for it?
The president's committed to making sure this gets done. We know that the wall and other security measures at the border work. We've seen that take place over the last decade, and we're committed to making sure the American people are protected. And we're going to continue to push forward and make sure that the wall gets built.
Why is he threatening a shutdown over paying for it? I mean, again, he said over and over again, he talked about the campaign over and over again. He said Mexico's going to pay for the wall. He asked people, his crowds chanted back, and Mexico's going to pay for it. And now he's threatening a shutdown of the government.
Now, once again, the president's committed to making sure this happens, and we're going to push forward.
But he's not saying that Mexico is going to pay for it.
He hasn't said they're not either. No.
So my question is similar to what those other reporters were asking.
Right.
Can the White House keep saying that Mexico is going to pay for the wall, but if Congress doesn't find the money to pay for the wall, maybe we should just shut the government down? They seem mutually exclusive.
Exactly. And you and I have listened to campaign rally after campaign rally, even up until, this year, while president, promising that Mexico would pay for the wall. So certainly there are questions about that. What's interesting here is that the president is calling for a government shutdown. I covered Congress and a few years ago when they shut down the government. That was led by Republicans in Congress, not by the president. Republicans now control everything in Washington. Back then, after they shut down the government, yeah, they saw some consequences come from it, but they didn't lose any seats. In fact, they gained the Senate majority the following year. So Republicans have weighed these consequences before. However, now that they control everything, including the presidency, that's a different story about what the fallout could be. There is not a lot of support here for the border wall. And remember, they're going to need Democratic support to pass some of these budget items. Right. So this is the president really, throwing, as many have said, a grenade in the Republican Party's plans on this issue. But it also gives Republicans a chance to perhaps call the president's bluff, particularly if he's going after them. They can send him a bill without the requisite border wall funding, or not as complete as the president wants it, dare him to veto it. If he does, perhaps that kind of shows the extent to which the party and the president are at odds with one another.
Do you agree with, I think it's right here, was it the Washington Post? I think the Washington Post, or maybe, do you agree with the idea that perhaps the president is trying to create cover for himself, that if these a lot of the legislation that he would like to have seen passed is not going anywhere, and now he's sort of pivoting to brand Trump as opposed to brand Republican Party?
Certainly. Yeah. You saw that in his tweets about the debt ceiling yesterday, going after Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell. Seeing that on the budget showdown, certainly. I saw it in Phoenix. This is kind of a preview, I think, to how the president might behave, or the concerns Republicans have about how the president might behave during the midterm election, kind of running against members of his own party, and also placing the blame on them for this. And in some ways, that could work, just considering that Republican members of Congress are on the ballot next year. Certainly, it would be a negative to his presidency if he were to lose seats. But this has been his MO the entire time. So this is what Republicans are trying to figure out, how to partner or not with Donald Trump at this point.
Okay, before you go, got to ask you about Gary Cohn. You know, he did this interview with the Financial Times. He said he certainly faced a lot of pressure to quit. He's Jewish, and he faced a lot of pressure to quit after seeing the way the president reacted to the violence in Charlottesville. He chose to stay. He said the White House has to do a better job at this sort of thing. What do you make of his decision to stay?
This is certainly striking, this interview, because everybody knows that the president will see it, right? Even if it wasn't sanctioned by the White House, the president will see it and react. Everybody knows what the president's reactions are. What's significant here about Gary Cohn is, first, he came here to do tax reform. He needs some credibility here in working with Republican lawmakers on this issue. This is his thing that he wants to work on. There's also, of course, as we know, been speculation that Gary Cohn might like another position like Fed chairman or something down the road, and that's what's kind of been keeping him here, these policy initiatives that he wants to get accomplished here. So we'll see what happens, but I think that's important to keep in mind, especially for him dealing with lawmakers down the road, not down the road, actually next month when they approach tax reform.
Caitlin Huey-Burns, so interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to see you.